This is a very famous painting by Eugène Delacroix, 1830, but actually I'm cheating. It's commemorating the French Revolution of 1830 that removed Charles V, the restored king, from the throne. But it's just such a glorious image and so famous that I'm cheating. Now, the core of my presentation is derived from chemist Loisel, an assistant professor of history at Trinity University, San Antonio, Texas, Freemasonry in Bordeaux, 1788, 1794. And at the end of the presentation, I'll give you the citation. Well, I wonder, I have my glasses on. Okay. This is going to be long and painful. It's blurry. Whether it was described by a 1789 anti-Masonic pamphleteer or by a 20th century historian, Freemasonry has often been seen as either a direct cause or indirect inspiration of the events, institutions, and sociability of the French Revolution of 1789. Which had very, very far-reaching results. The ancient regime and feudalism were dead. It unified France and enhanced the power of the national state. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars tore down the ancient structure of Europe, while major historical interpretations of the French Revolution differ greatly. Nearly all agree that it had an extraordinary influence on the making of the modern world. The values and institutions it created French politics to this day. A recent quote from a member of the National Front, a right-wing group in France that started around 1972, said, "France died in 1789. And what we're left with now is disgusting." I'm going to start off with some definitions and then a little summary of the revolution. Jacobin clubs, by name Jacobin, was the most famous political group of the French Revolution. And it became, after a while, identified as the most extreme egalitarianism and violence. The club got its name from meeting at the Rue Saint-Honoré, a monastery of the Jacobins, as the Dominicans were called in France. Both the political bookends of the revolution, the moderate Girondins and the radical Montagnards, started out as Jacobins. The Girondins, named after the river Gironde in southwest France, an area where many of the leaders came from, had wanted to avoid the execution of Louis XVI and supported a constitution which would have allowed a popular vote to overturn legislation. The Montagnards, meaning mountain, because they sat very high up in the assembly, accused because this caveat of voting would have allowed rural areas of France to vote against legislation that benefited Paris. They were composed mainly of members of the middle class, but represented the constituencies of Paris. As such, the mountain was sensitive to the motivations of the city and responded strongly to demands from the working class. Sans culotte, the French, without knee breeches. The upper class wore these silk knee breeches, the regular French, what we would call pants. Okay? A label for the more militant supporters of the movement, especially in the year 1792 to 1795. The leaders of the sans-culottes presented themselves as members of the poorer classes or leaders of the common people. The distinctive costume of the typical sans-culotte was the pantaloon, long trousers, in place of the sans-culotte, and as well as the carmag, short jacket, and the red cap of liberty. The cap of liberty was thought by many to be a Masonic symbol, but it was not. It's like many things in history we get credit for that we actually don't deserve. Moved. Okay, here we go. Sorry. In 1789, a cornered Louis XVI in the face of a financial crisis, widespread agitation. In 1789 itself, there was a 25% fall in real wages and an 88% increase in the price of bread, the staple food, and a weakening of royal power. Louis was forced to summon a national parliament, last called up in 1614, the Estates General. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate, the nobles, and the third estate, 98% of the rest of France. The deputies of the third estate, fearing that they would be overruled by the two privileged orders, in any attempt at reform, decided to take the tennis court's oath and break away from the Estates General to form the Assembly on June 17th. Louis XVI attempted to escape France in June of 1791, alienated many of his heretofore loyal subjects. The Federalist revolts, uprisings that broke out in the summer of 1793, they were prompted by a resentment in France's provincial cities, about increasing centralization of power in Paris and the increasing radicalization of the political authority in the hands of the Montagnards. The trigger, after the deputies opposed to the execution of King Louis were threatened by a Parisian mob and kicked out of the convention, the revolts failed to win any sustained popular support and were crushed by the armies of the convention in the following month. At this point, the Montagnards under Maximilien Robespierre, 1758-1794, unleashed their reign of terror. Robespierre was guillotined in July of 1794. Napoleon seized power in 1799. In 1797, 8 years after the storming of the Bastille, the natural philosopher John Robinson and the ex-Jesuit Abbé Augustin Barruel both published accounts of the revolution that placed responsibility on the Freemasons and their viewed puppet masters, the Illuminati, a Bavarian Enlightenment society founded in 1776 to advance somewhat radical Enlightenment principles. There is not a scintilla of evidence that the Illuminati had any link with French Masonry. Robinson and Barruel argued that the Illuminati had an elaborate plan to subvert the church, state, and society by infiltrating Masonic lodges and other institutions. They had supposedly made their way deep into the French elite and, in the guise of Jacobins, overthrew the monarchy. Basically, they say the order's triumph lay in its deceptiveness. To the king and public, they portrayed themselves as a benign organization of sociability with a penchant towards the occult. Within the walls of their lodges, however, the Brethren hammered away mercilessly against the French monarchy and openly preached and practiced democratic republicanism. Laws were devised, constitutions drafted, and elections held. Ignorant of Freemasonry's true purpose, the government permitted its expansion. And this obviously then there was no surprise that the Masonic model of politics directly influenced the Third Estate to break away from its traditional role in the Estates General in order to establish the National Assembly. With the creation of this body, France had become the Masonic government. So goes the theory of Barruel and Robinson. Robinson, by the way, was a Freemason. Unfortunately, to this day, his writings are still read as gospel by many anti-Masons. His main objection was to the elaborate French rituals that the French had come up with, not to the core of Freemasonry. Barruel and other French royalists were very nostalgic about an ancient regime they had lost and looked out upon with dismay and confusion upon a France they no longer felt at home in, that they no longer recognized. Talleyrand, French diplomat and grand aristocrat, described by Napoleon charmingly as shit in a silk stocking, stated, "Whoever has not lived in the 18th century before the revolution does not know the sweetness of life and cannot imagine what happiness there can be in life." Maybe to forge some sense of order or clarity, observers like Barruel sought out the principal authors of 1789 and singled out the Freemasonry as the organization most responsible for the coming of the revolution. In the summer of 1790, Marie Antoinette advised her brother Leopold II to watch out for any associations of Freemasons. He must already have been warned that it's through these means that all the monsters here hope to achieve the same goal in all the lands, the destruction of the church and the monarchy. This was the result of an incredibly successful propaganda campaign by anti-Masonic forces. It even snared an envoy of the Montagnards sent to quell Bordeaux in 1794. Before he ordered the closing of Masonic lodges, he softened his dictate by praising Freemasonry. In our republic, a number of societies known as Masonic societies have greatly advanced liberty by their hatred of tyranny. Today, without a doubt, they continue to advance their love of equality, which is the foundations of our revolution. Both the Queen and the envoy were sort of fooled by this propaganda rhetoric. By and large, lodges were not in the business of social equality, which fingered the Masons, identifying them along with Enlightenment philosophy as the corrupting historical agent that had corroded, quote, the vitality of the ancient regime. The anti-Masonic propaganda was built on ancient French foundations that since the 1720s, many French had been suspicious of the Freemasons as a disgustingly Anglophile institution, a nest of free thinkers, or as deists or even atheists in spirit. The Grand Orient of France, the largest group of French Masons, under the Second Empire, they had dropped any religious requirements and were overly political, in stark contrast to the 18th century Grand Orient, steeped in the values of the ancient regime and mostly apolitical and of a ecumenically Christian orientation. The modern Grand Orient did not help matters by proudly identifying Freemasonry as the cause of the revolution and adopting as its motto, liberté, égalité et fraternité. Because I guess the revolutionaries didn't have a whole lot of original symbolism, they adopted many of the Masonic symbols. Here you have a lady holding the Cap of Liberty, which, as I mentioned, was not a Masonic symbol, and then the level, a Masonic symbol of equality. The all-seeing eye was the Liberty Cap. The Hermes, I think, I don't know who the weird guy is, but he's holding a square and compass. I think it's Hermes. And Hermes again, the square and compass, and the all-seeing eye. This is a gathering of French elite to listen to a play by Voltaire. The philosophes or philosophers were viewed as instrumental in shaping revolutionary ideas. They were writers, intellectuals, scientists who shaped the French Enlightenment during the 18th century. The best known philosophes were Baron de Montesquieu, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Denis Diderot. Other lesser known figures included the mathematician and political scientist Nicolas de Condorcet, also a key political player in the revolution. All of these, except for Montesquieu, were Freemasons. So you can see where people got the idea. And even then, everyone thought that Montesquieu was a Freemason. So it was like the whole lineup. At the beginning of the revolution was probably the time that Freemasons had the most influence. 4 of the 10 of the most important revolutionary figures were Freemasons. But again, it was a popular assumption that practically all of them were, especially Robespierre. But they actually, as we'll see, didn't get along. They had different views. This is Louis Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, 1747-1793, a Jacobin, also Grand Master of the Grand Orient of France, and the closest male cousin of Louis XVI. In 1792, at the abolition of the monarchy, he changed his name to Philippe Égalité, Philip the Equal. He strongly adhered to the principles of Denis Diderot, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He voted for the death of the king. The king was especially shocked by the news stating, "It really pains me that Monsieur d'Orléans, my kinsman, voted for my death." That's pretty mild. I think I'd be using some rather stronger language. Though I think the majority of historians think he was sincere, there's been a strong undercurrent of people who felt his goal was to replace his cousin on the throne. However, for any such ambitions, if they did exist, he himself was guillotined in November 1793 during the Terror. Philip's Parisian mansion, the Palais Royal, was a common place for Jacobins to meet and discuss their plans and ideas. Many members of the National Assembly claimed that the Palais Royal was the birthplace of Freemasonry. Philippe was a very important figure in the unification of the nobility and the Third Estate. He led his minority group of 47 nobles to succeed from their estate and join the national
Assembly. Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, 1749-1781, a noble and scandal-plagued, debt-ridden womanizer. Oh, and mesmerizing orator, one of the greatest figures in the National Assembly that governed France during the early phases of the French Revolution, and acquired the reputation of a voice of the people, a moderate and an advocate of an English-style constitutional monarchy. During the royal session of 23 June 1789, a king sent an envoy to dissolve the assembly. Mirabeau said, "Tell those who sent you that we are here by the will of the people and will only leave only by the force of the bayonet." Mirabeau was one of the main proponents of selling church lands to private individuals in order to rescue the country from its financial disaster. Mirabeau expressed his utter contempt for the Duc d'Orléans, so it wasn't like it was part of grand Masonic scheme. He also attempted to form an alliance with the Marquis de Lafayette, but the two could not agree on a personal level, and Lafayette had his own theories about the new French Constitution. Marie-Joseph Marquis de Lafayette, 1757-1834, was a French aristocrat and military officer who fought in the American Revolutionary War and for a while was the French armies of the Revolution. He was a key figure in the French Revolution of 1789. Le Marquis de Lafayette was far from perfect. He was sometimes vain, naive, immature, and egocentric, but he consistently stuck to his ideals, even when doing so endangered his life and fortune. It was Lafayette who came up with the revolutionary rosette or cockard that combined the red and blue colors of the city of Paris with the royal white, and also was the root of the French tricolor. And Lafayette was also the principal author of The Rights of Man, the first draft of which he worked on with Thomas Jefferson. In July 1789, Lafayette became commander-in-chief of the National Guard, an armed forces established to maintain order under control of the Assembly. As leader of the National Guard, Lafayette attempted to steer a middle ground, even as radicals gained increasing influence and the right thought that he was nothing more than a common revolutionary. I don't have the date, but when a group of Parisian fishmongers, women, marched to Versailles to retrieve the king and bring him back to Paris, a very reluctant Lafayette and his National Guard accompanied them. And they were protesting the lack of bread in Paris. Lafayette tried to bring charges against both le Comte de Mirabeau, Freemason, and Duc d'Orléans, who he viewed as responsible for the march. Lafayette was very jealous of the Duc d'Orléans and persuaded him to go into exile in England, ostensibly for his safety, but really because Lafayette viewed d'Orléans as a threat to his control of the French Revolution. His goal was simply to get Philippe out of the country. Unfortunately for Lafayette, eroding revolutionary credentials, the king escaped from the Tuileries under the watch of the National Guard and Robespierre called him a damn traitor for that. And then probably the seal on his revolutionary credentials, a radical protesting mob in the Champ de Mars on July 17th killed a couple of people that they thought were spying on them. And Lafayette and his troops marched in. And, well, I don't know, it's like all these things, who's responsible? I feel that the National Guard was sort of provoked. But anyway, they ended up shooting on the crowd. And they claimed that there were only 10 killed. But Jean-Paul Marat, the radical newspaper guy, claimed over 400 bodies had been dumped into the Seine. And of course, this did not burnish Lafayette's revolutionary credentials. The death of Marat, Oil on Canvas by Jacques-Louis David, also a radical revolutionary. It's in the Royal Museum of Fine Arts of Belgium. Marat was assassinated 13th of July, 1793, by Charlotte Corday, a royalist sympathizer, while he was taking a medicinal bath for his horrible, debilitating skin condition. Jean-Paul Marat, 1743, 1793, French politician, physician, scientist, and journalist, described during his time as a man short in stature, deformed in person, and hideous in face. Not a fan of Marat, apparently, whoever. His journalism was renowned for its vitriol and ferocity and championing of the basic rights for the poorest members of society, and a relentless antagonism towards the moderate leaders of the Revolution, such as his fellow Freemasons, the Marquis de Lafayette. For some reason, he absolutely loathed Lafayette, couldn't stand him. And Le Comte de Mirabeau. He was actively buttressed by both in the chamber and street demonstrations by the Parisian mob. He rapidly became one of the most prominent members of the convention. And then in August 1792, he was part of a surveillance committee, and Paris freaked out because the Prussians were marching on Paris. So they rounded up all the counter-revolutionaries, and 4,000 were sent into Parisian prisons by late August 1792. The committee planned what to do with them. Marat thought that it would be a good idea to burn them alive. This charming plan was only not adopted because they were worried about burning the buildings around them down. So they ended up voting to butcher them, which happened in the first few days of September. In death, Marat became an icon of the Montagnards, as well as the greater sans-culotte population, and a revolutionary martyr, according to some contemporary accounts. There was even a prayer that mourned him, O heart of Jesus, O sacred heart of Marat. There's a print of a French Masonic initiation at Lodge around 1745, courtesy of Alani Prince. French Freemasons of the 18th century were in the main aristocrats or property. They were not, for the most part, in sympathy with social change. As Margaret Jacob in the Radical Alignment has pointed out, Freemasonry belongs squarely in the cultural universe of the Ancien Regime. Whatever actions of individual Freemasons, Freemasonry as a whole was indifferent to politics. Loisel, the historian I mentioned at the beginning, quote, Masonic affiliation appears as a rather unpredictable variable for determining revolutionary political orientation, as individuals and their lodges made choices based on other factors, notably their profession, social status, regional setting, and personal relationships to the local government. Despite its arguably Republican political practices, its anonymous voting, removability of officers, and respect for a written constitution, Masons in general did not intend to extend these principles beyond the lodge, but nor did most of their social peers. Um, the revolution in the end mainly benefited the bourgeoisie, which is why the working classes were left discontented, as proof of the revolutions of 1830, the turmoil of 1848, etc. Loisel feels that rather than seeking out the origins of revolutionary behavior or attitudes within ancient regime lodges, it might be better instead to view the Masonic setting as a fruitful historical laboratory where an institution of the Enlightenment encountered and adopted to a new political and cultural landscape in the final decade of the 18th century. For most of the revolution, the Masonic view and reaction to events was not all that different from that of the wider public. Freemasons were not, another quote, not transparent personifications of some type of coherent Masonic vision towards political authority. Such a vision probably did not exist anyway in the 18th century. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, which, which the Grand Orient claimed that they came up with. Probably not the case. Margaret Jacob still very much situates 18th century Freemasonry in the history of the development of constitutionalism that connected the English and French revolutions. The lodges, she writes, became one of the links in the chain that connects English political culture, and in particular its revolutions, to the late 18th century democratic revolutions on the continent. Loisel has this to say, the affinity between Masonic emphasis on constitution, laws, and elections and revolutionary politics is indeed suggestive, but ultimately inconclusive, as her analysis does not extend into the revolution itself. It becomes even more difficult to pinpoint the concrete impact Freemasonry had on engendering a political culture with some connection to the revolution, if we bear in mind Timothy Tackett's observation that the most formative political apprenticeship of deputies took form not in the ancient regime arenas of sociability, but rather in the political mobilization, the give and take that took place at the beginning of the revolution. St. John the Evangelist, one of the patron saints of Freemasonry, along with St. John the Baptist. French Masonry, 18th century Masonry, required that a candidate be of good character and a Christian. French Freemasons subscribed to a new humanism, shouldn't use words that I can't pronounce, eucharism between Protestants and Catholics that reflected a wider 18th century doctrinal indifference. Nevertheless, having been raised in an ancient regime world, they, for the most part, cherished at least the trappings of the traditions of the Catholic Church. The vast majority of French Freemasons did not countenance the revolution's hostility to the Church. Masons in general did not share the distinct anti-clerical position of the philosophes. Clearly could be found, and Christian symbolism and objects are prevalent in Masonic sociability and rituals throughout the century. The Bordeaux region of France. Now I'm going to go on to a little bit in depth about one particular Bordeaux lodge called Anglaise, of all titles, and was located in Bordeaux, which at that time in the 18th century was the second largest port in Europe after London. The Anglaise Lodge, one of the oldest French Masonic lodges, was created in 1732, but mostly by Irish merchants in Bordeaux. It only adopted French as a working language in 1743. As the oldest Masonic establishment in the city, they also oversaw the founding of local lodges and even those as far-flung as Edenton, North Carolina. On the eve of the Revolution, Anglaise largely comprised the prosperous commercial classes. Nearly 75% of Anglaise members were in commerce. The city's middling sort and elites were attracted to Masonry because it offered a hybrid amorphous sociability whose appeal lay in the diversity of its content, fashionable cultural currents such as mesmerism and occultism, as well as the pseudo-scientific teachings of Count Cagliostro, all find their way within the Bordeaux lodges of the 18th century. For members of Anglaise, however, charity work and conviviality remained their chief preoccupations. And the brethren envisioned the lodge as a sanctum far from the outside world, one in which they could devote themselves to forming lasting friendships. As the one orator put it, cosmopolitanism and patriotism could coexist neatly alongside one another within the Masonic mind. The charms of Masonry, he declared, following an invocation at the height of the terror, are the inviolable principles of love, both of one's country and humanity. Anglaise did measure a slow and steady decline in Masonic life, but members still managed to gather 260 times before July 1794 and held nearly 50 meetings in 1789. While they did discuss some political matters in the lodge, they quickly came to an agreement with the turmoil of the revolution. It just wasn't practical. So most of them probably joined all these political clubs that sprung up in town. But the revolution did intrude on numerous occasions. The lodge secretary regretted the absence of brethren, but found solace in the fact that they have left to be the virtuous defenders of the Republic, to assure the tranquility of French coast and to combat the enemies of freedom. Basically, the lodge met throughout the revolution, except for a brief period at the height of the terror in 1794, and they resumed meeting in 1795. They also continued to welcome brethren from England and Prussia, despite the outbreak of hostilities. Bordeaux members made no move to change their potentially scandalous lodge title, even after the declaration of war against Great Britain early February 793. To prove that they really were not into social leveling, their pre-revolution fees would have been 1/3 the annual income of a carpenter. And after, when they resumed 1795, they had a discussion about raising their fees or dues. And despite some protests, they raised them even higher. So it was no attempt to really bring in. With the announcement of the Estates General in early 1788, Bordeaux resembled much of the kingdom in that it soon was awash in political talk, print, and actions. Uh, Even then, the king tried to put an end to all these pamphlets that were spreading throughout the land, but he wasn't successful. This vast quantity of pamphlets, which would have provided members of Anglaise with a running commentary on local and national events. Later that year, all three estates, and also Anglaise was right downtown at the center of all this activity. The three estates began meeting in order to decide upon their choices of deputies and draw up a respective cahier de doléances, or basically what they were pissed off about. Excuse my language. So then, for the members of Anglaise in Bordeaux in 1788 or 1789, would have been a gripping, exciting political apprenticeship for them right down at the center of town as they were meeting. At first, the Anglaise brethren were quite cheerful about the revolution. They thought it would improve their finances. Aristocrats would get taxed, so generally there'd be some fiscal reform that would benefit them. They only really turned against the revolution, which from their point of view took on a ghastly turn because mercantilism or capitalism was viewed under the terror as almost as bad as being an aristocrat. So they obviously would have had no reason to go along except from fear. But so when they lost control, or they and their peers lost control of the Bordelais government, that's sort of when their enthusiasm for the revolution dwindled. The opening period of the revolution, they saw the king and the National Assembly as working in tandem. And as I said, the French public expressed warm attitudes towards Louis before his flight. And as Anglaise speeches, the first mention of the revolution was they had a plan where they were going to have a dinner for St. John. And the secretary had mentioned they were going to have a toast to the revolution and to the king. But when the actual dinner came, they bagged the toast to the revolution and just toasted the king. Already in the mid-1789s, they all would have had to wear the cockade or rosette to enter any public building. After the news of the king's flight, now I don't think it's fair to blame Marie Antoinette, but she persuaded the king that it would be a good idea to take off. And actually, he had a fairly large reservoir of sympathy, as the father of the nation. But when the father is caught booking out of town to try to escape France. Doesn't look so good, and it caused most of France to turn against him. Gradually, the members of Anglaise had to adopt. They had to put the French flag on their stationery. They had to put pro-revolutionary signs outside their lodge. They had to sing the Marseillaise. Oh, I think I didn't cover that. Both the guy who wrote the Marseillaise and the guy who invented the guillotine, who actually popularized it, were Freemasons. It's called the Marseillaise because troops marching from Marseille sang it. It was actually the war chant of the Rhine when he composed it. And I didn't have the technical know-how. I was going to start my talk. It was a rousing rendition of the Marseillaise, sort of like in Casablanca. But I said I didn't have the technical know-how. At the first, the candidate just had to affirm that he was both an honnête homme, an honest man, and a Christian. And they tried to cling to that as long as possible. And they also tried to use the Gospels for as long as possible. After a while, it just became too tense, and they had to, all their toasts had to be to the prosperity and perpetuation of the sublime French Republic, as well as to the representatives of the French Republic in the convention and the initiations. They also had to start using the Republican revolutionary calendar. Finally, they had to cease calling their feast the Feast of St. John and adopt a revolutionary name for their feast. They also finally had to cave in and change the name of their lodge to Égalité, nice revolutionary thing to it. But as soon as 1795, at the moment that there was no reason for Anglaise to maintain this facade of revolutionary fervor, they reverted to their own name and to their Christian orientation of their lives. But I guess it got so tense that you had no choice. And it was just like, you might lose your head if you didn't go along with it. But they think only one member of the lodge guillotined. The monument of the Girondins, as I mentioned, the Girondins were the more moderate, and a lot of them came from Bordeaux. So when they were massacred, Bordeaux viewed them as martyrs. So apparently there's this huge monument to them. When the revolt against Montagnard happened in Bordeaux, it was a little different. And armies suppressed in other cities. Bordeaux was starved into submission. And when the terror committees were set up, that's when, as I say, Anglaise stopped having really any interest except for a facade of the revolution. Two of the main envoys from Robespierre were Claude Alexandre Isabeau, and his colleague came later, Garnier. Isabeau actually was an ex-priest and a Freemason, and actually he visited some lodges. Anglaise invited him over. There's no record of whether he showed or not. Loisel speculates that they might have been inviting him over to show their revolutionary fervor, their stationary with the French flag and all those other deals. But Isabeau was recalled for being a weenie. Robespierre didn't think he was inflicting enough terror on Bordeaux. So he sent Jacques Garnier, who was much sterner stuff and did not lack zeal. And upon his arrival on 10 July 1794, he closed the Masonic lodges. In his degree, he identified the importance of friendship amongst brethren, and a number of historians have argued that the rationale of Freemasonry was to create and nurture a culture of male friendship, both within and beyond the lodge, and it was these strong bonds of solidarity that proved to be Garnier's overriding concern and reason to close the lodges. Garnier warned that Masonic friendship and the private sphere of which Freemasonry was a part had no place in the revolution. It is in these societies, he claimed, where moderantism, moderation, can establish itself as a system. It is here that the rigidity of surveillance crumbles, where one prizes a far too intimate friendship over the austere rigidity that anchors the inflexibility of republicanism. Doesn't sound very fun. Covered by the cloak of friendship, conspirators can take up arms against liberty. For this reason, he argued, there can only exist one lodge, that of the people. Less than a fortnight later, in a letter to the Committee of Public Safety, he reiterated the belief that closing the lodges had stifled counter-revolutionary activity. The revolution is starting to take place in Bordeaux. The measures that I took against the Masonic societies has produced the most fortunate results. While the notion that Freemasonry purposefully staged the revolution has lost most of its intellectual heft, there's still a rearguard action because, as I hope I've conveyed to you, it's quite startling. Writing the Marseillaise, the guillotine, the first three major politicians in the revolution, all of the philosophes. It does seem as if we were heavily involved in the revolution, but the historical writers do not agree with that view, and I have no choice but to go along. But if you want to think we played a little role, that's okay. Freemasons were also blamed for other revolutions, such as that of 1830, the European turmoil of 1848, and the 1917 Russian Revolution. So our reputation goes on. I often say, as my parting words, that if we fade away, we will live on as long as there are conspiracy theories. Because we're blamed for practically everything. With that, I conclude my speech. I have a horrible feeling that I left some trunks out, but I hope it had a measure of coherence and that you enjoyed yourselves. Thank you. Any questions?